You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This week's episode is about rational thinking, and I'd like to share with you what I think is the most powerful way of exposing an irrational idea and of working out for yourself whether or not an idea that's being put to you is rational or not. This is a really powerful tool of thinking, and it's also quite fun too. So that's what I'm going to talk about this week. Before we get to that though, I just want to say a big thank you to my new patron on Patreon, Theodore K. As I mentioned last week, I'm now doing a bonus episode every week for my patrons. So if you're interested in getting bonus episodes of The Voluntary Life every week and many more rewards, then you can do so by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. And to find out more about that, I will put a link in the show notes, which you can access directly on your podcast player, or you can go to my Patreon page, which is patreon.com/thevoluntarylife, and find more information on my website, thevoluntarylife.com. I'd also like to say thanks very much for all the nice comments I received back about our update episode about Barcelona last week. It's really nice to hear that people are interested in what we're up to, and I really appreciate all your kind feedback. So on to this week's show. I want to tell you about one of the types of logical argument that you can use in order to quality check an idea that someone is presenting to you to see whether or not it is a rational idea. If someone presents an argument to you and you think it sounds irrational, but you're not quite sure and you want to try and refute this argument, there's lots of different approaches that you can take. And I want to share a particular approach or a particular tool of argument that I think is the best. I say it's the best way to refute an irrational argument, not because this is necessarily going to convince somebody who's making the argument to you that they're wrong or that what they're saying is irrational. It's not necessarily going to get them to change their mind. It may do. If someone is making an irrational argument, but they're well-intentioned, then when you use this particular kind of response, if they're well-intentioned, they will think about it and it will get them to change their mind. However, unfortunately, people do often take great pleasure in holding irrational beliefs. Irrational beliefs can be very comforting and giving them up can be very hard. So this isn't necessarily going to change other people's minds. That's not why I want to share it with you. I want to share it with you not so that you can win the argument against people making irrational claims. The real value of this is for yourself to help you to sniff out irrational ideas and to find a really good way of getting to the heart of a problem of an irrational idea. So it's for you to inoculate yourself against bad ideas using this particular technique or tool. And you may, in the process, also have a huge effect on bystanders. If you're having a discussion with someone, you might not necessarily persuade an irrational person to change their own ideas, but this can have a very positive effect on other people. So that can also be a help to others. But the main reason I'm sharing it with you is for yourself. The interesting thing about irrational arguments is that when someone presents an argument that you think is wrong, your instinct, if you're anything like me, might be to argue with them, to push back against what they're saying, and to try to tell them that they're wrong, or show them that they're wrong, or show them the flaws in their argument. And of course, you can always do that with an irrational argument. If somebody is making an argument that's illogical, or there's a flaw in their argument, you can show them what the problem is. But actually, the approach that I'm about to tell you about is quite different. It is to embrace their argument. Rather than running away from a bad, irrational idea, the way that you really find out whether an idea is wrong, whether it doesn't make sense, whether it doesn't conform to logic and rationality, is to embrace it and push the idea even further than the person who was making the argument. So don't try and stop your opponent from expressing the idea. Don't play tug of war with them about the argument, but rather take over the argument and push it even further to show where the logic of the argument goes. In other words, what you're doing is you're making their argument more consistently and following their logic down to the path of its conclusion. When you do that, what you do is you show that if you do push their argument to its logical conclusion, the conclusion is absurd. By absurd, I mean ridiculously unreasonable. So that's what this technique is about. It's about embracing somebody's argument, pushing it to its logical conclusion, and showing that it's absurd. And in technical terms, it's called the Argumentum ad absurdum, which just means argument from absurdity. It's a way of refuting an idea rather than by directly arguing with someone. You show the consequences of the idea by pushing it even harder. You can do this because all unreasonable arguments are absurd if you state them without gloss or misrepresentation. The only way that people are able to get across unreasonable or irrational ideas is by saying them nicely or saying them in a way that hides or obfuscates their real consequences. So the argument from absurdity, or argumentum ad absurdum, is a way of bringing out that absurdity. So this all sounds very abstract. So I want to give you a wonderful example, and it's an example from economics. Economics is one of those fields where you hear a lot of irrational arguments, because one of the most common irrational things that people hold on to is the idea that you can have your cake and eat it, or that you can get something for nothing. And people love economic arguments that seem to give them what they want without consequences that they don't like. Free stuff, basically. Who doesn't like free stuff? And so there are many economic theories that give you the idea that you can get all sorts of great free stuff with no bad consequences. You could say that all bad economics is based on the idea that you can get a lot of free stuff without having to worry about the consequences. And good economics is generally about working out what the consequences, and especially the unseen consequences are of any particular economic policy or economic act. So you're bound to hear a lot of irrational ideas in the realm of economics. And one irrational idea that's still with us, that's very popular, you've probably heard it a million times in different forms, is the idea of protectionism. Protectionism or mercantilism is a theory that has been refuted again and again over hundreds of years now in economics, but it's such an appealing idea that it keeps coming back. And in fact, most of the world is run by this idea at the moment. The idea is that you need to have tariffs to prevent your own economy from being flooded by cheap goods that will undermine domestic industries by undercutting them. And that if you implement these tariffs, then not only do you support domestic industries, but those industries will go on to employ people and require supplies and other services, and therefore generally help the economy as a whole. And so that's why we need tariffs. That's the idea. Now, I've done a podcast episode in the past about the idea of comparative advantage and explaining why it is that we all get richer if we all trade with each other. And that's true even if a country is not the most competitive in any particular field. It still gets richer by trading with other countries, and it's especially true at the level of the individual. So I've explained all of this from a kind of reasonable point of view, but a stronger way of explaining it is not the way that I did in my previous episode on comparative advantage, but the way that a French economist did in the 19th century in a satirical essay. And this French economist was called Frederic Bastiat, or Bastiat with English pronunciation, and he wrote an essay called the Candlemakers' Petition. So I'm going to read an excerpt from this essay, and then I'm going to explain how he pushes this argument to its absurd logical conclusion to show you that there's a problem with the argument itself. This is obviously written in the 19th century, so some of the terms are from the 19th century, but it's called the Candlemakers' Petition, and it's a petition to the government from the candle makers and various other producers associated with the lighting industry. So here's Frederic Bastiat. We candle makers are suffering from unfair competition of a foreign rival. This foreign manufacturer of light has such an advantage over us that he floods our domestic markets with his product, and he offers it at a fantastically low price. The moment this foreigner appears in our country, all our customers desert us and turn to him. As a result, an entire domestic industry is rendered completely stagnant. And even more, since the lighting industry has countless ramifications with other native industries, they too are injured. This foreign manufacturer who competes against us without mercy is none other than the sun itself. Here is our petition. please pass a law ordering the closing of all windows, skylights, shutters, curtains, and blinds, that is, all openings, holes, and cracks through which the light of the sun is able to enter houses. This free sunlight is hurting the business of us deserving manufacturers of candles. Since we have always served our country well, gratitude demands that our country ought not to abandon us now to this unequal competition. We hope that you gentlemen will not regard our petition as mere satire, or refuse it without at least hearing our reasons in support of it. First, if you make it as difficult as possible for the people to have access to natural light, and thus create an increased demand for artificial light, will not all domestic manufacturers be stimulated thereby? For example, if more tallow is consumed, naturally there must be more cattle and sheep. As a result, there will also be more meat, wool, and hides. There will even be more manure, which is the basis of agriculture. Next, if more oil is consumed for lighting, we shall have extensive olive groves and rapeseed fields. Also, our wastelands will be covered with pines and other resinous trees and plants. As a result of this, there will be numerous swarms of bees to increase the production of honey. In fact, all branches of agriculture will show an increased development. The same applies to the shipping industry. The increased demand for whale oil will then require thousands of ships for whale fishing. In short time, this will result in a navy capable of upholding the honour of our country and gratifying the patriotic sentiments of the candlemakers and other persons in related industries. The manufacturers of lighting fixtures, candlesticks, lamps, candelabra, chandeliers, crystals, bronzes, and so on will be especially stimulated. The resulting warehouses and display rooms will make our present-day shops look poor indeed. The resin collectors on the heights along the seacoast, as well as the coal miners in the depths of the earth, will rejoice at their higher wages and increased prosperity. In fact, gentlemen, the condition of every citizen of our country, from the wealthiest owner of coal mines to the poorest seller of matches, will be improved by the success of our petition. So that was Bastiat's Candlemakers petition. I just want to make the point how brilliant it is that he leaves the reader at the end of this knowing that this is so fishy, this argument. Obviously, there's something absurd about the idea that we ought to have a law to close all windows so that everyone has to use lighting all day long. They have to burn candles all day long. You can see that that's a totally absurd idea. And yet he shows that all the arguments that he makes for this idea are exactly the same arguments that people who want protectionism make against free trade. It's all the same arguments. And I actually read you a shortened version of the Candlestick Makers petition, but he has a longer text where he anticipates all the objections that you might put to this, and he shows why this is the same logic that people who call for laws to protect domestic industries, why when they say, oh, we'll all be richer because it'll help support the economy and it'll increase everyone's well-being, he shows how wrong this is. And you can tell how wrong it is because it just intuitively everyone understands that we would not all be richer if we were forced to rely on artificial light rather than using the sun, the light of the sun. So that's a wonderful example of an argument from absurdity. As you can see, Bastiat is also taking the piss out of protectionists, as we would say in English. I mean, he's ridiculing their argument, and it is satire as well. And you might think that because this is satire, that it's somehow less of a clever argument than if he were to simply take on protectionist arguments as in a kind of scholarly polemic or something. But actually, Bastiat was a great economist, a very intelligent guy. He knew exactly how to refute these arguments in a more boring way, but he chose this way because it's actually a way that is far more powerful as a refutation of irrational ideas. This is why politicians, and especially tyrants, hate comedy and comedians, and they're afraid of ridicule and of being laughed at. Because one of the most important things about comedy is that it is full of arguments from absurdity to show how irrational our leaders are and how silly many ideas are. And that's why comedians can be dangerous to regimes. So if you listen to any stand-up comedy that's good, you're probably going to hear the argument from absurdity made all the time. You'll hear comedians pushing an idea to its logical conclusion to show how silly it is. And it's the basis of satire, it's the basis of a lot of stand-up comedy, and you can see it in literature as well, especially science fiction. That's another realm where the argument from absurdity is used to critique political ideas and other irrational ideas. If you're a patron of the Voluntary Life, check out the bonus episode that I'm going to put out later this week, where I'm going to provide some examples from literature of where this argument is used quite effectively in different ways to provide a critique of our current society by showing in a science fiction dystopia way where certain irrational ideas could lead. And I'm also, in that bonus episode, going to provide more examples of how to use this idea and how to understand it. And of course, you should use this technique on yourself as well, on your own ideas, to push your own ideas to their logical conclusions and force yourself to see whether or not things that you believe are in fact irrational and absurd. And I'm going to talk about some of my ideas in the bonus episode too, to explain things that I pushed to their logical limits and ways in which I had to change my mind by doing so. So I think this is a wonderful tool of thinking and a wonderful protection against bad ideas. This is why tyrants are afraid of laughter, because behind satire and comedy there is actually a deep philosophical truth, which is that by pushing ideas to their logical conclusion, you can often show how absurd they are. And in doing so, you expose bad ideas for what they are. So I hope you find that interesting. I'd love to hear what you think. That's all for this week's episode. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.